Tonight we begin to uncover a body of knowledge that was in fact stolen from its African creators. Indeed, it is a stolen legacy. This is the Bunker Hill Monument in Boston. It and the Washington Monument are structures known as obelisks. They were constructed in the early part of the 19th century to commemorate Revolutionary War heroes. Africans in an ancient land that they called Kemet were the first to construct obelisks of solid granite over 170 feet high. They were religious and scientific instruments. The obelisk could be used to determine the meridian for astronomical calculations and as an accurate shadow clock. An African-born mathematician named Eratosthenes used an obelisk in Kemet to determine the radius and circumference of the Earth. Here's how it could be done. By measuring the shadow of an obelisk of known height, the angle of the sun can be determined. Then, traveling a known distance and measuring when the sun is directly overhead, as evidenced by the absence of shadow, suggests that proportion which can be easily solved for the radius and circumference of the Earth. This milestone in history demonstrates that African technology was advanced and thorough enough to prove the Earth was round long before Columbus made his voyage. Good evening. I'm Natalie Christian. Our purpose here tonight is to begin to set the record straight about the contributions that Africans made to what we call modern civilization. As the title of our show implies, Stolen Legacy is about some of the advancements made that were in fact stolen from their African creators. We borrowed our show title from a book of the same name by George James. To help us begin to uncover this knowledge are two people who have spent a great deal of time and energy researching and gathering data on what these contributions were and their impact. My guests are Dr. Asa Hilliard, a national authority on African history, the former dean of the School of Education at San Francisco State University. Dr. Hilliard is currently the Callaway Professor of Urban Education at Georgia State University in Atlanta. He has developed many educational programs on our topic tonight. He has lectured on the subject and has taught seminars as well as published numerous articles. Also here is Samuel Matthews, a math teacher at Boston Latin School for the past 6 years. Mr. Matthews attended Rutgers University and is a graduate of the New England Conservatory of Music. He is a member of the Teaching About Africa Institute in Chicago and has lectured on the subject of African mathematics. Later on in the program, we'll be taking your phone calls so you can ask your questions of our experts, and we'll be offering a list of books that you can read to find out more about those African contributions. So stay tuned. Welcome to you both. Glad to have you here.
Thank you.
We need to first of all find out about Kemet. Sam, tell us, what is Kemet?
Well, Kemet is the African name for what is generally known as Egypt. Kemet, from the hieroglyphics, KMT, there were no vowels in their language, means black crossroads or a black village. If you go to World Book Encyclopedia, you would have that interpreted as black soil.
Okay.
But Kemet is what is commonly known as ancient Egypt.
All right. Asa, what kind of civilization was this? I mean, we know it as Egypt, but it was not Egypt. That's another name that was given to it by another culture.
Right. I think it's important to keep the chronology straight while we're talking about the title. Again, the name is Kemet, K-M-T, and in the Medidnetur, which is the name for hieroglyphic, Greek people changed the name of the writing system to hieroglyphics, but Medidnetur is the appropriate name. There's a plural determinative right by that name, and there are two little people sitting by it. So Kim is the strongest word in the Kemetic language for the word black, and when you put two people beside it, you're talking not only about the black soil, but also about the black people. This is a nation that got its beginning approximately 3,100 years before the birth of Christ, and it is a civilization that lasted intact for approximately 3,000 years. No other civilization on record has lasted that long. In other words, the cultural continuity of the nation was 3,000 years long, taking it, in fact, longer than 3,000 years because it lasted until after the time of Christ. The important thing about it, in response more directly to your question, is that it was the first of the fully developed high technical civilizations that are still on the record. Now the Kamites themselves actually referred to older civilizations further south in Africa when they turned to the south and faced what they called the Holy Land, their home. They said they came from upriver, at the source of the river to be specific. And they talked about there being older civilization, and they were children of that civilization. But what's important is that when Kemet appears in the human record, it appears in 3100 BC with a fully developed civilization. Writing was already in place. Astronomy was already in place. They already had the 365-day year calendar and 1 quarter for the leap year and all of that. That calendar had actually been put in place around 4236 BC. So we're talking about a fully developed, high technical civilization.
All right, well, let's talk about some of these technical advances. One of the things that we talked about in the piece earlier, Sam, was the mathematics and how it was used. They developed to a point that they knew that the Earth was round. What other concepts in mathematics are we talking about here? Well,
it's true. You certainly wouldn't want to determine the circumference of the Earth unless you had, of course, presupposed that the Earth was round. We want to point that out. All of the mathematics that we study today has its roots in Africa. We can start off simply with counting. The very first or the oldest known artifact in mathematics is the Ashango bone. That's over 8,000 years old. It's from the Congo. That's found in Africa. If we go ahead, they had developed fractions. Furthermore, they had developed algebra and, of course, geometry, trigonometry, and it even gone as far as the roots of integral calculus. And this is all before Europe existed.
And we're going to be taking a look at some pictures, some slides in a few moments, but while they're getting those set up, what about the sciences? Beyond the mathematics, what other kinds of advances are we dealing with here? And Asa, you can jump right in.
Well, one of the things that's interesting is to know that the upper province of Kemet was referred to as Chem. That's spelled C-H-E-M.
Okay, why don't we take a look at that? We have a map of that. Go ahead, Sam.
And that's the root of the word chemistry. So that's an indication to us that the sciences of the earth were first studied there in Africa.
Okay.
Medicine as well.
Right.
The ancient Kemites were known throughout the ancient world as the best of all doctors. Homer tells us that, as do many of the Greek historians.
Sure. Asa, now, of course, I think a question that I have, and many people have, is how did they develop this? I mean, where did this knowledge come from?
Okay, the best, and we have to speculate on this, but some things we do know is that in Kemet, you had an unparalleled opportunity to be scientists. In other words, you have land that has regular cycles that work almost like clockwork. Every year the flood came at the same time, receded at the same time. You had a clear sky. You never had clouds. You had an unparalleled opportunity to observe stars. You had the need, for example, to develop mathematics in order to be able to lay out the land again and divide it among the people after the floods had receded. You had a religious orientation in Kemet whereby the people had a respect for nature through intensive study of nature. And having done that on the same spot, in other words, these were not nomadic people, they were sedentary people who had been on that same spot for thousands of years, which again gave them the opportunity to notice certain kinds of regularities in nature. So as from what we can determine, they spent a great deal of time in botany, in observing the stars, and observing the animals and so forth. So they had tremendous technical knowledge of all of these things, and out of that technical knowledge then flow the sciences, the arts, and literature.
Sure. And now some of those symbols, Sam, we have adopted in our own culture today. For example, the dollar bill. There are a number of symbols on there, and we're going to look at some pictures now, which in the Kemetic context, and how they have gone from that to what we know of today. Sam, what are we looking at here?
Well, if you look at the top, that's the Eye of Horus. That's also found on the dollar bill. The scarab beetle there with wings.
Yeah.
That was taken for the U.S. seal as the eagle.
Mm-hmm. Can we move on?
Mm-hmm.
All right, now here we see the differences in the, or actually the same symbols.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting as to why those symbols find themselves on the back of the dollar bill.
Why those symbols?
Well, that's because the history of Africa is intertwined with the history of Europe. Mm-hmm. And as late as the early 19th century, Africa was still being studied, though in secret. And this is a result of masonry. In fact, the term mason itself is a derivative of the African language, the Kemetic language, Ma, which means true, and Sin, which means brotherhood or builder.
Now, those are the symbols broken down.
Now, the eye...
They mean something.
Well, the eye itself is actually the hieratic symbols for fractions. Mm-hmm. As I said before, they did invent fractions, and symbolically you can see there that each fraction has its own part for the eye, and they total 63 over 64.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, it's always interesting to see those symbols because I don't think too many people understand what they really mean and why they were adapted. Anything you want to add to that, Asa?
No, you notice that the eye actually sits at the peak of the pyramid.
Sure.
Every pyramid had a capstone made out of black diorite, I believe the material was. And on those capstones, frequently, they would actually have the two eyes of God. You know, that particular eye should have been the right eye, and which would be the sun, symbolizing the sun, as one eye of the Creator, the other eye of the Creator being the moon. But you notice that on the dollar bill, you combine the symbol of the all-seeing eye of God with the pyramid itself. So you have not just one, but two of the African symbols in a part of what Americans treasure most. And those will only be the beginning, because we're going to see more symbols besides not just the pyramid and not just the eye, but you'll see filtered into American culture and Western culture all of these symbols that come off the African continent.
Well, what other symbols
well, the tenkanu would be another one, which you call the obelix. The Greeks, remember now, the Greeks changed the names of all of these things that Africans had, so we know them now mostly by their Greek names. So the Greek name for what you call, let's say, the Washington Monument is obelix, but the Kemetic name is tenkanu. And that would be another example of something that's been borrowed in large cities all over the world, major cities all over the world have taken, they've either stolen actual obelixes or tenkanus from Kemet and set them up, like in New York, in Central Park, and the Vatican has one. And when they couldn't get real ones, they manufactured them. They're supposed to be out of one single block of stone, but they had actually manufactured these things and put large bricks to make them up. But that would be one other example of another symbol that was taken over. The cross is another symbol, the Christian cross. Initially, the Christian cross was actually the Kemetic cross, which we see as the cross of life. It's the cross that has a little hole in the top. And then later, it changed from the Kemetic cross to the cross that we now have today.
Very interesting. Well, we'll be talking more about those symbols as we move on. We're going to stop here and take a break, and we'll be right back. Stay with us. Kemet was founded by the black populations from the heart of Africa. As such, today's Afro-Americans can identify and take pride in this great civilization in the same way Europeans can look to ancient Greece or Rome. If a typical Kemetic citizen lived in our society, he would be called black or Afro-American. One sees the faces of their royalty in our contemporaries. Menes, the first king in history. Zauser, the first to construct pyramids. Queen Tai, mother of Akhenaten. Had they lived in one of our southern states before desegregation, they would have been forced to the back of the bus. If they lived during the early 1800s, they would have been slaves. This was the dilemma that confronted the West when the faces and glory of Egypt poured into Europe and America after Napoleon's campaign in 1797. What civilized people would enslave the first civilized people? The process of denying an African origin for Egypt and civilization began. Ancient writers, many of whom were eyewitnesses, concur that the Egyptians were African and were founded by the people from the interior of the African continent. They also confess that much of their own culture was African. The Parthenon, a standard of Greek architecture, is a replica of the Temple of Luxor, where many came to complete their educations. Greeks seeking knowledge and wisdom traveled far to study geometry, religion, astronomy, and Africans. The rulers of the 25th dynasty, founded in 800 BC, hailed from Nubia. They revived Kemet's classical period in 600 BC. Most notable was the construction of the smaller pyramids. Most remarkable is the fact that this technology and these people reached what are now the Americas and influenced the building of civilization here.
All right, one of the main points here that we need to perhaps bring out, Ace, I'll start with you, is that this culture was in effect stolen from the Kemetics by the Greeks. The Greeks went to Kemet to study, to find out what was going on with the world.
Right, well, okay, let's, again, it's really important to keep chronology together. The first Greek that we have on record is Homer, and that's approximately 850 BC, if there was such a person. Many literary critics suggest that there were many people and their writings were collected together and then given the name Homer. But be that as it may, at that point, Greek people were not actively involved in the educational system as far as going to school in Africa. But starting around the time of Thales, which would be in the 5th century BC, Thales went to school. We have records of the Greeks themselves. These things are in standard history, so what I'm saying is not a mystery. Thales went to school, came back, advised Pythagoras to go to school. Pythagoras went to school in Africa, was taught for 22 years in Africa. We know the subjects that he taught, that he studied. We know the location where he went to school. We know the name of his major professor. Following Pythagoras, other pre-Socratic Greek philosophers began to go to Egypt for their education. Plato went to school for 12 years in Egypt. Aristotle moved his school when Alexander the Great, his pupil, conquered Egypt. He moved his whole school to Egypt in order to be closer to the source of Egyptian knowledge. In fact, the habit by Greeks of going to school in Egypt was so ingrained, and they valued it so much, that they say that even people who had not gone to Egypt to study would make up biographies to pretend that they had gone, because you had very little legitimacy if you hadn't actually gone to what at that point was the center of higher education in the world.
All right, Sam.
Yeah, well, the Greeks saw a good thing and they took advantage of it. They recognized that the knowledge and wisdom to the south of them was greater than theirs, and they went there to study. But what we have to do is recognize within our culture what is African and what came from Africa. In the previous piece, we saw there the Temple of Luxor and the Parthenon. Now, I have taken pictures of the Temple of Luxor and shown it without identifying it to people and asked them, what do you think you see there? And invariably I get the answer, the Parthenon, I see something from Greece, or I see something from Rome. But very rarely does anyone say, this is possibly Africa.
I think we have another picture of that that we're going to take.
Yeah, so what we have to do is...
That's the Temple of Luxor, that's not the Parthenon.
That's not the Parthenon.
The dating on that, by the way, is approximately 1300 BC is what you're talking about. For the Parthenon, you're talking about around 500 BC. So this is almost 1,000 years older than the Parthenon.
Okay. Any other points there, Sam?
Yeah, about Pythagoras. I think that's one person in particular that we should take a look at, because he has been given so much credit for things that were actually African in origin. He's been given credit for the theorem that bears his name, a squared plus b squared is c squared. But it should be known that that was known 2,000 years before his existence. And furthermore, we have evidence from papyri that the Egyptians also knew about rational numbers, and they credited numbers as having values, things with having values, and Pythagoras is known for that, but indeed he went there as a student.
Let's take a look at this next shot. It's someone that we should know, but that we don't know. Yeah. Sam, who is this person?
That's Akhenaten, an 18th dynasty pharaoh. That's the same dynasty that Tut was from. In fact, he's a relative of Tut. What's important here is to look and see that if you use your eyes, you see a man of African descent. However, if you see artists' renditions of Akhenaten, it's rare. In fact, I've never seen one that actually displays his African features. So that's been taken. Moreover, to indicate to you how the historical and the academic community has stolen, you'll take a look at his lips, and people will tell you or have told us that his lips are puffy, not because he's black, but because he has a disease. And then furthermore, they've gone further to actually come up with the disease. Unfortunately, the disease that he supposedly had would render him sterile, and we know that he had 7 daughters.
All right. And this next person, let's take a look at her. This is Queen Ty.
Yeah, that's his mother.
Okay.
And, as we can see, she possibly suffered from the same disease.
Asa, what was significant about Queen Ty?
Well, of course, Queen Ty, this is one of the queens in the 18th dynasty that you have records in Kemetic of Greek people coming to pay tribute to her. You know, in other words, there was a contact between Greece and between Kemet, as not only as early as the 18th dynasty, but in Greek legend it goes back almost to 2000 BC. But that particular woman, she is the mother of both. She is the mother of Pharaoh Akhenaten. Some people suggest she may be the mother of King Tutankhamun, or as we call her, King Tut. But she was also very special because she was not just a sit-at-home queen. It is written that she was a co-ruler with her husband, Amenhotep III, so that the two of them are pictured in some statues as sitting side by side. Usually when the pharaoh is shown, the wife may be standing behind. In the case of Ramesses, the wife is made small and even standing by his leg. But in the case of T and Amenhotep, they're seen sitting side by side of equal height, which has
equal partners.
Equal partners in the ruling of ancient Kemet.
Well, was this unusual at that time where women did rule?
Well, in Kemet you had women in ruling positions, which means that you can look in the cartouches. The cartouche contains a royal name, and only kings or queens could have their names in a cartouche. If a queen also had a Horus name, in other words, not just a royal name, but the Horus name says that you were the ruler indeed, then you would say that she ruled the country. And so there were many of the women who did, but the one that is most famous is the Queen Hatshepsut, because she was in this same 18th dynastic period as Akhenaten, and her beautiful temple is now in the Valley of the Kings. It still can be seen as one of the most magnificent buildings ever built in the world, still studied by architecture students all over the world. And that is at the request of Queen Hatshepsut of the 18th dynasty.
All right. We're going to stop here and take another break, and we hope that we're bringing out some questions for you that you may have on your mind, because we will be taking your phone calls in this next segment, so stay with us. We'll be right back. My guest, Sam Matthews, now will tell us about the African presence in the New World. Sam?
The African presence in the New World did not begin with slavery. 2,000 years before Columbus, Africans were shaping the course of civilizations that would later be known as Aztec, Incan, and Mayan. This work of art is found in Boston's Roxbury section. Its creator, John Wilson, was inspired by similar works of art he saw in Mexico. These striking stone tributes dispel any theory that does not place blacks in the New World not only before Columbus, but before Christ. They date as early as 600 BC. Note the Ethiopian black braids. These monuments are concurrent with the Kushite 25th dynasty of Kemet. They were erected by the Olmecs, a civilization which is the foundation of the Aztec, Incan, and Mayan cultures. The colossal stone evidence is supported by numerous figures from the Olmec and subsequent cultures in ancient America that insist upon an African presence. Their attire and broad features leave no doubt as to the origin of the subjects. The pyramids produced by the ancient Americans were indeed influenced by Africa's own. Even today, strong currents off the coast of Africa will sail any sturdy vessel to the Caribbean. Vessels such as Queen Hatshepsut's obelisk boat had been constructed in Kemet 700 years before, clearly demonstrating the maritime ability of Kemet. These constructions have been shown to be sturdy enough to make the transatlantic voyage. When Columbus returned to Europe after his second voyage to America, he reported that the Indians had told him of blacks who had settled in the area. It's true. Africans came first to America not as slaves, but as masters of science and technology, influencing the civilizations that Columbus and Cortez were to find.
Little note here we'd like to give you. If you're interested in finding out more about the legacy left by the ancient Africans, we have a list of books that we can offer you. You should just send your inquiries to Stolen Legacy Bibliography, WLVI-TV, 75 Morrissey Boulevard, Boston, 02125. And we are going to be taking your phone calls now. 288-3120 is the number, so if you have a question of my guests, please call 288-3120. Again, that number is 288-3120. Sam, now we're skipping here, but about the African presence in the Americas, what was so significant about that?
Well, first we want to point out that slavery had three components to it. There is, of course, the physical slavery, which is ended. There was the removal of the goodies from Africa, the mineral wealth. And then there was a mental bondage that was imposed upon the African mind. That is a cultural lobotomy of sorts that removed history and removed any value from the personage of the African. And what we're trying to do now is re-heritorize Africans. That is to show that Africans played a major role in the creation of civilization and the furthering of civilization throughout the history of mankind.
Okay. You want to add to that, Asa?
Well, the only thing is that, in the first place, we're indebted very much to Dr. Ivan van Sertima for much of the information that has been synthesized to help us to understand the proof of the fact that ancient Africans actually appeared around 700 or so years before Christ in America. And, of course, we're one of the few people who have the physical remains, in effect, rock Polaroids of the pictures of these Africans that did that. Might also add that LeGrand Clegg in Los Angeles is one of the top scholars who has helped to uncover much of this information about the African influence on the Olmec. But what I want to clarify, just so that any of your viewers are trying to put this together with what they know about Olmec, what we're saying is that Africans influenced Olmec, not that Africans were Olmec.
Okay.
That Africans appear in small numbers, and then after a short period of time, the elements of African culture begin to be disseminated throughout the Olmec and later world, such as pyramid would be a case in point. Pyramids don't appear in America until after the African Olmec contact.
Okay. Well, let's go to the phones and see what kinds of questions our guests have. Good evening. You're on the air. What's your question?
I wanted to ask, we're being told a lot of things that Africans have done before others. I wanted to know how you would answer critics who say the things that you're telling us are wrong, or they're not valid.
Good point. Asa, you want to try that?
Well, since we've been talking about lots of things, I would have to know which thing the critic would say would be wrong.
Well, I think what he's trying to say is, thank you very much for your call. What he's trying to say is that, you know, just everything that we're talking about here, I mean, we're talking about rewriting history books.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the history books say one thing, and we're sitting here saying another. So what gives here? Who's to say that what you're saying is right and what the history book says is wrong?
Well, again, most of the things that we're saying here today, for example, if we say that Greek people went to Africa to study, we're simply quoting the record of Greek people. In other words, these are not new items of information that we just simply manufactured. You will see in Plutarch's Lives, for example, in Plutarch's work on that the reference to Pythagoras going to study astronomy and mathematics in Egypt is clear. That comes from the Greek or the Roman side before it ever comes from the Kemetic side. So that, in other words, there are many elements of documentation that we could easily share. The easiest way to deal with anyone who would criticize the information, however, is for the critic to specify the thing about which they have some disagreement, and then allow us to marshal the evidence to support that. But I agree with the caller. I fully expect that some people have to sit back and say, well, how could this be true?
But then we can all say that history is one man's interpretation anyway. Let's go to another call. Good evening. What's your question?
My question is, I would like to know, how do we get society to acknowledge the African origin of modern civilization in today's textbooks?
Ace, well, Sam, why don't you try that, being a school teacher?
That's a good question. As a matter of fact, you see, there is now a crack in the wall of the racism that separates Africans from their true heritage. And there's what I call the translucent history that's now being written. If you take a look now at a modern history book of U.S. history, you will find references to Africans, though not put in any historical context. For instance, you'll see references to Africans being with Columbus, though they won't mention that one of the pilots of one of the ships was an African. They'll say that he had Africans with him. They'll say the same thing about Cortez, and they will not tell you that these Africans were not just along for the ride, but in fact had directions along with them.
Okay. Do we have another call? I think we should go to line 0, all right? Good evening. What's your question?
Yes, I'd like to know if African influence extended onto the Far East.
The African influence in the Far East is what he's saying. Thank you so much for your call.
Okay, I'm really happy that he asked that question. I wish I had better detailed information, but let me make a reference to the fact that that you have a series of migrations coming out of Africa, first to populate the world. In other words, early man starts in Africa, so of necessity, the first people in all these early places were basically African. However, I think he's talking more about the modern period, and it is through the work of people like Runoko Rashidi and Wayne Chandler and others who specialize in the history of the African presence in Asia, who spell out the details to show, for example, that the earliest population in India is the Dravidian population in India, which is a basic African population. Even in China, as Runoko Rashidi points out in his work, the African presence in early Asia, at least one of the dynasties, the Shang dynasty, around 2000, if I'm not mistaken, it's around 2000 BC, was an actual black African dynasty. In fact, they were referred to as oily black people. And so there is, throughout Asia, in the Middle East, and there are military people who have gone to places like Vietnam and who have seen some of the people in Vietnam and been shocked to find their dark color, even after years and years of separation from
Well, if you write in for the bibliography, we do have a book on that list that talks about the African influence in Asia. Let's go to another call. Good evening. What's your question?
Hi. I'd like to know if Egyptians were of black African influence, Why aren't they portrayed in most Egyptian art that I've seen with black skin or dark skin?
Oh, thank you. Let me handle that.
Hey, so you want to handle that?
Okay,
Thank you so much for your call.
Yeah, I really want to thank him for that. You have to realize that most Egyptian art that is sent to us, we see out of chronological order. For example, if you go to the British Museum, you will see the museum is set up so that you see mostly Greco-Roman material, but it's side by side, let's say, with an 18th dynasty piece. If you really want to see the black origin of Egypt, you will look first at the mummies, the actual royal mummies. Look at all the royal mummies of the 18th dynasty, for example. Every one we have is not only dark, but black, very black. If you look at the artwork, we showed some of the artwork in the earlier segments. You saw the picture of the Sphinx from the side view, totally black. You saw Pharaoh Senwosret or Usertsen, totally black. In other words, if you do Old Kingdom first, and if you do kings and queens, then do Middle Kingdom, then do 18th dynasty, and then after that come to the Greco-Roman dynasty, which is in the classical period, you will see that it goes from black to the time of the Greco-Romans when you see royal kings like Alexander the Great, who is white.
Sure. Has nothing to do with disease or anything else. Let's go to another call. Good evening. You're on the air.
Yes. Good afternoon. Good evening. I agree with them, and of course, Professor Joseph Jonckinen in New York City agree with them. Do they believe that Freemasonry started in Africa?
Which of you want to tackle that? You want to try that, Sam?
Maybe Asa can finish it off. Yeah.
Thank you for the call.
First off, as I've said, the term itself, Mason, is an African one. The problem that exists is that the mystery system that Freemasonry developed out of had to be suppressed at one point during European history, and the participants had to go underground.
Okay. Asa?
Right. Well, Sam is correct. See, we know that there was first an ancient educational system that is fairly fully described right now, that was located with its center at a place that today is called Luxor. Or Waset was the old name of the city. That's where the temple of Ipet Isut, which is Karnak today, and Luxor are. And this was kind of a headquarters for a giant university system that peaked in the 18th dynasty around between 1500 and 1300 BC. That system was the system that Greek people encountered operating at the time that they became acquainted with Africa. They were very much impressed by that system. And within a short period of time, they entered that system and adopted its tenets and especially its religion, which meant you had to adopt its educational system too. So that for almost 600 years, the dominant religion in Greece and Rome, before and after the time of Christ, 300 years before, 300 years after, the dominant religion was the religion of Isis, which was suppressed when the church was established by Constantine in approximately 325 AD, I think it was, when the Council of Nicaea was called. That meant they had to drive underground the Kemetic worshipers and initiates and education. And then we have, after that period of time, time and time again, a return to the ancient Egyptian wisdom through secret societies. And if you'll notice in the Masonic order, almost all of their symbols come out of ancient Kemet. Now, as to whether or not it started there or not, I don't have enough knowledge to know, but the circumstantial case is so heavy that we would be wrong to consider almost any other alternative.
All right, we're going to stop here and take another break, but we will be taking more of your phone calls in our next segment, so stay with us. We'll be right back. Let's go back to the phones. Hello, you're on the air. What's your question?
Hello, I'm very interested in this subject, and I'd just like to know why were African ideas stolen instead of adopted, and what did the Greeks have to gain by stealing these ideas instead of giving full credit to the African society?
What did they have to gain,
Well, some Greeks did give full credit to the African society. It was there were people who later on, for example, when I think of the stolen legacy, I don't think so much of the Greeks per se as I think of people who came along later. For example, Professor Martin Bernal has done a book called Black Athena. It's published by Rutgers Press. It's a brand new book, meticulously documented by the grandson of one of the great Egyptologists. And in that, he locates a particular university, Göttingen University in Germany, approximately the late 1700s, that started a process of changing the story that the Greeks used to tell about where they went to school. So Greeks readily and freely acknowledged that they went to school in Africa. It was later, really in the last couple hundred years or so, that we've had that story changed, and that was changed for reasons that we can only speculate about.
Sure. All right. Sam?
Yeah, let me add just one thing to that. A good, for instance, in what Ace has just said is the fact that they've even gone as far as to come up with another disease, Egyptiomania. And those were the people who were ancient Greeks who had this fantasy that their ancient ancestors were Egyptian. So this was all created in the 19th and 20th century.
Let's take another call. Good evening. You're on the air. What's your question?
Yes, my question is concerning genetics, and if, in fact, it is possible, as I've heard.
Can you speak up, please? We can hardly hear you.
Okay, yes, my question is concerning genetics, and if, in fact, it's possible for a black man to be original man, and from him, the brown man, red man, yellow man, and white man are descendants.
In 25 words or less. This is getting into another whole era.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your call, sir.
I refer you to National Geographic magazine, November 1985, to Newsweek magazine, January 11th of this year, and through studies of bones and also studies of mitochondrial DNA, the molecular biologists are now telling us that the original man was a black man. And both those publications actually summarize the research in popular form and placed that age somewhere around 200,000 BC. And on the cover of Newsweek, they actually pictured a black man and black woman. And the idea is that there is a single black woman, according to 3 separate groups of molecular biologists who are doing this work. There's a single black woman who is the 10,000th great-grandmother of everybody on the planet. So that while I can't answer for the geneticists, the process by which this would occur, the reporting that they have given us is that these were black people.
All right. Clearly controversial for sure. Good evening. What's your question?
Yes, I'm concerned about Cleopatra, the Queen Cleopatra and African queens. Can you simply talk about their contributions?
All right. Thank you so much for your call. Cleopatra.
I don't really... I have to say, frankly, I don't know about Cleopatra. Cleopatra is one of the Ptolemaic queens. She comes at a time when the Greeks are in there. That's at the end of
Was she black?
Well, I'm just saying, that's at the end of the 3,000-year period. What we know is that she lived Egyptian, she spoke Egyptian. In other words, all her behavior and actions were Egyptian, which would have meant that she, the best guess you would make would be that she would be black. But if you look at some of the coins that are supposed to have come from the time, then it leaves a question. So I don't want to go further than the evidence will let us go on that. Many black historians claim Cleopatra. I don't see that it's important one way or the other because Egypt had already done everything that it was going to do by the time Cleopatra got around.
All right. Thank you. Good evening. You're on the air. What's your question?
Yes. If blacks are the original founders of mathematics and the first to civilize this country, how can you explain the reason why the white people have the recognition?
Thank you so much for the call. Sam, you want to try that?
Well, we didn't say that they were the first to civilize this country. No, that would be an insult to the people that were found here. We're saying that they influenced the civilizing of this country. Whites have credit because they've taken credit, and it was necessary to do so during slavery. Simply to take a man and take away his freedom and take away his family, his culture, there had to be some reasoning for it. And the reasoning came out of the academic world that blacks were inferior genetically, etc. And that's how it's done. It's simply taken. But if you look now, you'll see that it's being taken back.
Okay. All right. Let's take another question. Good evening. You're on the air. What's your question?
Yes, I have a question concerning the history. Although the history does show that there's been a lot of achievements made
Can
in the
you
past.
speak up, please?
Yes. Even though the history does show that there's a lot of achievements that have been made in the past by blacks, how today can black people, through education, institutional, social mechanisms, realize some of the inherent capabilities that they have?
Sam, you want to tackle that? Thank you so much for your call.
Yeah, this information is empowering. It's very important for us as black people to have self-esteem, and that's exactly what happens once you recognize that slavery was not the beginning.
Sure.
You can then see that slavery will not be the end.
Very important point. Knowledge is power. Good evening. What's your question? You're on the air.
Hello. Is the oppression of the majority of the black population today related to a natural cycle, and whether or not the black race would again have a chance to become part of a civilization similar to the one you're discussing?
Asa, can you handle that? Thank you so much for your call.
It's a part of a culture. It's a part of a cultural cycle. I don't believe that it's God's plan that black people be on the bottom. So that would be a natural cycle. But I do think it's a part of a cultural cycle. The consequences of war, particularly the consequences of colonization, slavery, and segregation, has put us at a disadvantage. Now, the question as to what the future holds, I have no doubt whatsoever that as we become more conscious of not only who we were, but who we are, and what our innate potential is to compete, to be peers in the world, that we will see the kind of changes that we hope for in a very short period of time.
Indeed. Good evening. You're on the air. What's your question?
Yes, I would like to know if, in fact, it was Carthage and not Greece that was the father of democracy.
Thank you for that call.
Thank you.
Sam?
Well, that's not one that I can answer clearly.
Well, I don't. Yeah, I'm not sure that how was Greece the father of democracy when Greece had slavery? You know, it was democratic in a way, in terms of, I guess, the city-state organization. But I don't know enough about Carthaginian written records to see that in Carthage that you have the antecedents of Greek. It could be that you would have that in Carthage. I was also trying to come down with a definition of the political system of Kemet, which is older than Carthage. You know, Carthage doesn't come online until the first millennium BC, whereas Kemet had 2,000 years even before that. And if it had a democracy, you know, which is, in fact, it did, because the king stood as the representative, but the priesthood was in the same way that Greece was democratic, that Kemetic priesthood had democracy among themselves. So it would be a little hard to say. I guess we'd have to say, I'll have to give you an I don't know on that.
Okay. Good evening. You're on the air. What's your question?
Yes. My question is, can your host briefly discuss the chronology of the displacement of the Kemet culture and who was specifically involved in that displacement?
Thank you so much for that call.
Okay, you have approximately 30 dynasties, which means 30 families that ruled Kemet starting in 3100 BC. In the first 1,000 years, you have two kingdoms within those first 12 families. You have 12 families in the first 1,000 years, and you have the Pyramid Kingdom, and then you have kind of a classical kingdom called the Middle Kingdom. There's an Old and Middle Kingdom. And that means that the Kemites had it all by themselves for 1,000 years before you get an invasion from Asia of a group of people called Hyksos. The Hyksos stay in power from around 1750 BC to maybe 100, 150 years, and they left almost nothing behind. And then you get this grand golden age of the 18th family or dynasty, which is 18th and 19th family dynasty, called the New Kingdom. And after that kingdom, you have a breakdown, and then you get a return to classical Kemetic civilization in the 25th dynasty around 750 BC. Notice that all the four kingdoms are southern-led native kingdoms. And then after that, it's after the 25th dynasty, as Dr. John Clark at Hunter College, New York, is fond of saying, that was Kemet's last walk in the sun politically. You know, that was the last time that the native people of Kemet controlled their own political structure.
Okay. Good evening. You're on the air. What's your question?
Hello, my question was in regards to the pyramids, which is, in my mind, the greatest Egyptian architectural feat. How do your people feel there about that the pyramids were actually copied from the Sumerian ziggurats?
Thank you so much for the question. Sam, you want to tackle that?
Well, they're older. They're older, and what do we have left of the ziggurats? They're just shapeless clay mounds at this point. In fact, the ziggurats have to be reconstructed by artists' conception. So, if anything, one would want to look the other way and see that...
Where are these, the ziggurats?
It's talking about
Mesopotamia.
Mesopotamia.
You see, Mesopotamia is given credit as the cradle of civilization to direct you away from the middle of Africa, which is really the cradle of civilization.
I see. All right, Asa?
Right. If you look at the date for the pyramid, again, I think Sam's point is very well taken. The stones that we're talking about are still standing. The first pyramid, which is a ziggurat, which is the step pyramid, not the true pyramid, was the model upon which other kinds of pyramids developed. Now, the issue is really the dating of Sumer, Elam, and Babylon, and so forth. And we know that Babylon really never appears until approximately 2100 BC, about 1,000 years after Kemet starts. The argument is about when was Elam and Sumer, and not only that, what was the nature of Elam and Sumer, which preceded Babylon, whether these were really anything more than city-states or whether they were nations in the sense that Egypt was. But clearly, if that kind of technology had developed to the level that it had developed in Kemet, then we would expect to have seen a great deal more remaining from it, and maybe someone would have an explanation for it. Much of the dating, however, seems to me to be pure guesswork.
All right. Good evening. What is your question? You're on the air.
Yes, ma'am. This is...
Can you speak up, please?
Yes, ma'am. This is from the book They Came Before Columbus. I would like to know the presence of a white god that they speak about that came before the Aztec and the Mayan people. Was that person, in fact, an African?
Thank you for that call. Who wants to tackle that? Sam?
I'll tell you briefly about the kingdom of Mali, which existed in the 14th century, and there was a king there, Abu Bakr II. And in 1311, he took sail off of the west coast of Africa, and he did actually reach the New World. And that's the God that he's referring to.
Well, again, he's referring to the fact that the Indians said something about a white god. Now, I can't answer it, but I remember, I can't give him the technical answer to the question, but I do remember a discussion about whether they